So welcome everyone to the 9th lecture in the series on current issues in Labour's economic policy. My name is Ewan McGaughey and we're talking this evening about universities and education, but I'm going to focus particularly on nurseries. I know it's close to the end of term. Hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. We've got one more lecture after this on big tech. I'm really happy that today we've got Jim Dickinson from a leading higher education publication called WonkHE, or WonkHE. You see what they did there. And so I look forward to a good discussion after the first half. So like with all these things, I'll talk for the first roughly 45 minutes, and then we can get into a discussion. This is the first pledge that we had from Keir Starmer when he was running for Labour leadership. He said that we should support the abolition of, or he would support the abolition of tuition fees, and he wanted to invest in lifelong learning. So, you know, the education system from the cradle to the grave. And you might remember back around that time, during the Labour leadership contest, it was still official Labour Party policy to have a national education service along the same sort of inspirational lines as with the National Health Service that we talked about last week. So support the abolition of tuition fees and invest in lifelong learning. And then when it came to the manifesto, things became, let's say, a little bit more refined. The manifesto says on page 86, Labour will continue to support the aspiration of every person who meets the requirements and wants to go to university. The current higher education funding settlement does not work for the taxpayer, for universities, staff, or students. Labour will act to create a secure future for higher education and the opportunities it creates across the UK. The explicit pledge to support the abolition of tuition fees at best is muted, or it's being downplayed, but there's a recognition of the funding settlement not working. And then at the other end of, or right at the beginning rather, of the educational journey that we go through on life, Labour has this big pledge around nurseries. So Labour will open an additional 3,000 nurseries through upgrading space in primary schools to deliver the extension of government-funded hours that families are entitled to. And so what we've got, all in all, leaving out schools in the middle and other kinds of adult learning for universities and for nurseries, which we're going to focus on today, we can group the pledges into three. So first, there's this idea of abolishing tuition fees. Secondly, we've got to look at the broader financial position of universities and have a funding settlement that works for taxpayers, universities, staff, and students. And thirdly, 3,000 extra public nurseries and keeping this commitment that the last Conservative government had given for government-funded hours. Just in case you're not aware, what they have pledged is 15 hours a week free childcare at nurseries from September 2024, so that's already come into force. And next year it will go up to 30 hours of free places in nursery for children aged 0 to 3. There was already provision for free hours after the age of 3. So those are the pledges in summary, and like with all the other lectures, what we'll do throughout the rest is go through human rights backdrop, the legal background in the UK, see where we sit internationally with some data, and then talk about reform models that are open and the costs and benefits of different kinds of reform. Okay, so starting with human rights, believe it or not, the Universal Declaration was pretty straightforward about education. Everyone has the right to education. How much education, you might ask? Well, it doesn't get into that, but it does say education shall be free and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. So you might go, well, what does that mean if education is equally accessible to all on the basis of merit? Does that mean the same thing as free? And the answer in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which recasts the Universal Declaration into an international treaty that every country in the world pretty much has signed, was that, on the basis of merit does indeed mean free. So the Covenant, UK as a signatory, we've ratified. The Covenant says elementary education shall be free, and then it also says higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of merit, in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. And of course that reflected that in 1966, not every country had made university free, but back then the UK government did precisely that soon after this treaty. So not only was university free, there were no tuition fees, but also people got grants. And the same thing was reflected in the European Social Charter, the partner to the Convention on Human Rights. Member states should be reducing or abolishing any fees or charges and granting financial assistance. So that's the Charter from 1961, and it's still there in a new revised form from 1996. For the lawyers in the room, the partner to the Social Charter, of course, is the European Convention on Human Rights. And in one of its protocols, it does contain a section on, or an article on education. But it's very, very open, it's very broad, and in the Belgian linguistic case and other decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, it said that there's no inherent content to the right of education there, different to the Social Charter. And that matters because the Human Rights Act 1998 in the UK makes the European Convention on Human Rights effective in domestic law, so you can sue for breaches of a right that you got under the convention through the Human Rights Act, and public authorities have to abide by it, but we don't have the same provision for enactment within domestic law for it to be directly effective when we're looking at the European Social Charter, or indeed the international treaties. So even though the UK sort of signs up to them, it doesn't actually have any legal mechanism to make sure they are effective. And in a recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights, Ponomariovi and Bulgaria, the European Court in Strasbourg said that essentially member states have to make primary school and early education free, but there's a sort of sliding scale as education becomes less and less essential. And it said, albeit an over to dicta, that it was within the state's margin of appreciation to charge international students fees. It wouldn't be a violation of the convention to have university fees for international students. And so then you can imagine, well, sliding scale, so maybe home students can be charged fees. In fact, they probably can under the convention. And so that's just to underline that the standards that we've got that are enforceable in human rights law are some way behind the original aspirations of the international community in the 1966 Covenant or the European Social Charter. So how do, as always with human rights, how do these principles, if at all, come down to earth in UK law as it stands? So I'm going to divide this into three parts: university fees and finance first. Secondly, we'll talk about the legal background of universities' governing system or governance. And then thirdly, nurseries. As we all know, those of us who are sitting here and probably paying them, international fees and home student fees are very high in the United Kingdom. So there is no limit on what can be charged to an international student to go to university in England. So I think masters in law at the moment are costing something like 38,000, 33,000 pounds. Okay, very good. And just a little anecdote, there's actually a competition amongst universities to keep raising the fees to the highest possible level, because King's realised that if it charged more in fees than UCL, then we got more applicants than if we charged lower fees, because people want to go to the university that appears to charge the highest fees. So you know, it's a bit like, you know, a law degree is a bit like perfume, you know, more expensive looking the brand. And that shows you, you know, how uncontrolled the if you like, global market for higher education is. So we've got limitless international student fees at any level, and also at master's level. It's unregulated. And then for home students, if you're from the UK, there is a limit, but it's a very high limit. So currently it's £9,250 a year. This is going to rise along with inflation to £9,535 a year from next September. Now, university fees got tripled back at the start of the last decade in 2011. And one of the things that universities had to do when they got a tripling of fees is that they had to create, and before that as well, in fact, from 2006, they had to create access and widening participation plans for the promotion of equal opportunity. So on the one hand, the law changed so that this enormous monetary barrier came into being to get into university. You had to pay a lot more. But on the other hand, universities were required to do what is usually known as widening participation measures, which I guess in some way are slightly trying to row back on the inherent barrier that fees create. This is for England. If we go north of the border, Scotland, north of Britain, then we see that there are no fees for Scottish students, but if you're an English student going to Scotland, you will have to pay fees. But Scottish students don't pay any fees if they stay in Scotland. That's because it's a devolved matter, and the Scottish Parliament has consistently refused to introduce the fees that we did in England. What are the other sources of funding for universities? You get big lumps of money for research from different research bodies. The main one is called the UK Research and Innovation. It has a fund, and it's also got 9 sub-councils, which you might have heard of: the Arts and Humanities Research Commission, the Economic and Social Research Commission, and the Medical Council, beg your pardon, and the Medical Research Council. And they distribute funds to universities as the Secretary of State considers appropriate, and the Secretary of State can give directions. Along with these councils, universities are also allocated money according to what's known as the Research Excellence Framework. So university academics like me all get graded every few years, and then universities that have lots of academics with high grades get a certain amount of money, and there's different amounts of money given for universities that are not performing well. This itself costs a lot of money. So I think the figure is something like £550 million to conduct a research excellence framework. It might be a bit lower than that. A third major source of funding for some universities is endowments. So Cambridge is slightly the richest. I know the figure that I've got up here shows that it isn't, but Cambridge's figure is from 2022. It's got the biggest endowment. Don't have a figure for 2023. Oxford for 2023 had 8 billion. Edinburgh is third. It has 559 million pounds. Then there's King's, 300 million quid sitting somewhere. Glasgow, LSE, Manchester. And these endowments can be used to finance some of the activities of universities, or it can just sort of sit there and grow, which is mostly what endowments do. Okay, so if you look at the pie chart of university finance sources, you can see that now, since tuition fees rose and rose and rose again, 53% in 2022 of university funding came from tuition fees. Then we've got funding body and research grants, so that's mostly public in the sort of red and orange segments of the pie chart. And then we've got other income, investment income, and then green as an endowment. So most money, this is the key point, most money is now coming from students paying, being made to pay for university. And that big blue segment has essentially replaced money that was coming from the government before 2011. So tuition fees used to make up a much smaller proportion of university funding, and when the Cameron and Clegg coalition government from 2010 launched the austerity program, cutting the public sector. This was one of the consequences for universities, that public funding was essentially replaced by tuition fees. Now, how is all of this money managed? Well, you have to look at who runs the universities. University governing bodies are mostly self-selecting. So you've got a council of King's College London, or you've got something like a governing body or a board of directors for each university. And the people on the governing body will select their own successors. Most of them, and this is under the sort of guise of being independent, most of them are there for a period of time, but are not elected by any particular constituent group, with the exception of a few notable universities, which have roughly between a quarter and 2/3 that are elected. So I want to take you through those examples because I think they're important. So the first one is Cambridge. So Cambridge has a governing council of 25 people, and it has 16 of those who are appointed by staff from a body called Regent House, and that's just basically everyone who's an academic with a certain amount of seniority. Then you've got 3 people who are student representatives elected by students, and then you've got 6 who are drawn from management. So roughly 2/3 of Cambridge's governing body is elected and accountable to a stakeholder group. And that probably makes it the most democratic university in the United Kingdom. The next one, surprise, surprise, is Oxford. So Oxford has a council of 25 people. 11 are elected by what's known as the congregation, and again, that's academic staff. 4 are external parties, but are approved or are subject to approval by the congregation. Then you've got 3 students who attend, and 7 of the remaining people come from management or get a position by virtue of their office. And both Oxford and Cambridge had these structures since the 1850s. There were big protests after the revolutions of 1848 in continental Europe. The academics rose up in revolt against what they called the narrowing oligarchy of the university that had taken control, and they wanted to take back control. So there were commissions set up for both universities to recommend changes to governance, and there was an Oxford University Act of 1854 and a Cambridge University Act of 1856, which created the structure where the councils were majority elected by staff. Now, when we look around the rest of the country, London also has a few examples where you have more stakeholder representation. So King's College London has a council of 21 people, and if some reforms finally go through, which I was very heavily involved with, we will have 5 members of the council who are elected by staff via what's known as the academic board, which is itself elected by staff. There will be 2 student representatives, probably drawn from the student union, KCLSU, but then that will still leave 14 members who are appointed by existing management. So you see majority self-perpetuating body. London School of Economics has 6 people elected by staff, 2 by students out of a council of 25. UCL has, again, 6, 2 student representatives out of a council of 20. So London sort of comes in second place in representation, but you can see it's quite far off from being democratic because the majority are unelected. If we go to Scotland, also, Scottish universities, very good universities, they have much more representation than the general norm around England and Wales. And in fact, they have an act. The Higher Education Governance Scotland Act 2016 said that each university has to have a governing body, and rather than setting any sort of rigid sort of framework, they said that there's minimum standards of at least 2 people elected by academic staff and support staff, 2 from, I think that should be trade unions. Oh yeah, there we go. So 2 elected by staff, 2 elected by the academic union, and then the professional services staff union, and then 2 by students. But the problem with the Scottish legislation, it doesn't put a cap on what the number of the people on the governing body are. So essentially the voice that they have could be watered down. I mean, if you had a governing body that had 9 people, then it would look very democratic. But in fact, what you find, for instance, with Edinburgh University, is that you've got what they call a university court. That's like the council or the board of directors, which has 23 people last time I checked, and can have a maximum of 25. And when we look around the rest of England and Wales, standards are very, very much lower. I mean, I'm missing out quite a few examples. Manchester's different, Bristol's different, but the general rules around England and Wales are set by the Privy Council in an order which sets up an academic institution's constitution, and the Education Reform Act Schedule 7 and 7A says that there's actually maximums of 2 representatives of academic staff and 2 from students. So, you know, outside London, Oxbridge, Scotland, you don't have very much representation of the stakeholders who make the university, or you would think who make the university at all. That legislation covers 46 universities, mainly the newer ones. Okay, so rather undemocratic governance is the general picture in universities, but still interesting. And if you were at the corporate governance lecture, you'll see that it's a very big contrast to your normal corporation listed on the FTSE 100, where it's pretty much all the directors self-appointing. So now on to nurseries, their finance and governance. So nurseries don't have to be provided. So a local authority under the Education Act 2002 may organise a nursery, but it doesn't have to. And so that means that nurseries don't really get set up by the public sector all that often because they cost money. And local authorities haven't had very much money for the last, at least, let's say, 14 years. So there's limited numbers of public preschool nurseries. And if you look at the composition of the nurseries, 61% of nurseries, and also that accounts for 69% of nursery places, are from the private sector. Those figures come from the Department of Education, but actually the industry is in such a mess that we just don't really know. We don't have any good official statistics. That will probably change as the free childcare rules are kicking in, or the free hours, because government will necessarily have to collect data. Remember, Labour is pledging to have 3,000 new public nurseries by using up space in schools that hasn't been used yet. To put that in context, we currently have just over 20,000 nurseries around the UK. But there's probably a much, much bigger demand than that figure, because if everybody is getting 30 hours of free nurseries for all children, then there's just going to be more people who want to go to nursery. When we look at the fees that private nurseries have, just anecdotally, I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, I can't give you a data source, but it's pretty obvious that public nurseries and not-for-profit nurseries charge much lower fees than private nurseries that have shareholders. You can see that looking around London. I mean, the work that some of the work that I did related to King's and collective bargaining showed that very clearly. When you have a shareholder-run nursery, they need to pay shareholders. Fees are a lot higher. To give you an idea of the difference, just take an example near me. There's one in Burgess Park run by a group called First Place, and they charge around £1,200 a month if you have a child in the nursery for 3 days a week. The one that is charitable, not-for-profit, and run by parents charges around £800 a month. I'm not getting these figures exact, but that's an indication of how big the difference can be. If you have a nursery in the school, then it's going to be subject to the rules on school governance, and we have, a bit like the Scottish Act for universities, very kind of loose regulation in the Education Act 2002 that says school governing bodies have to include staff and parents. But in 2011, the Conservative Liberal Democrat government reduced the maximum number of staff representatives on a school governing body to 1, and also the numbers for local authorities, so clamping down on stakeholder representation. There's no specific legislation for nurseries, but if you have a nursery in the school, then that will be the applicable rule. And to set this in context, paid with the rest of the sort of labour rights and childcare framework, parents can only take very limited leave from work that they get paid for. Paid family leave is only 6 weeks at 90% of salary if you're on maternity leave, plus 33 weeks at the statutory rate of £184. If you're taking paternity leave, there's only 2 weeks on £184. So that means that when the amount of paid leave that you're getting is so limited, people really need childcare in order to go back to work. And so the two meeting in between would be the sort of desirable outcome, so that when you finish your paid leave from work, there is a way to put children into nursery in a way that doesn't break the bank. Okay, now, so how do we do compared to the rest of the world when we look at the data? The summary is that we have fees going up, but at universities, staff pay is going down. There are big problems in the UK with access to universities based on class. We've got scandal after scandal regarding international students accessing universities with lower grades than home students because universities are chasing fees. And the picture for innovation in the UK, which you'd expect would come from the university sector, is looking pretty grim as well. So let's go through that. This is the picture of the international picture on fees in OECD countries. So we've got a bunch of OECD countries down the bottom. And what the chart is showing, if you look at the circles, that shows you the level of fee in US dollars for your average public university. Okay, so we've got $0 up to $20,000 for a bachelor's degree, an undergraduate degree. And what you can see over here, where the orange arrow is England, with fees of something like $12,500 US dollars for public universities. You can see that France, Germany, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Turkey all have 0 fees. You can see that most other countries in the OECD have very low fees. America is over on the left-hand side, and I think it's important to point out why it looks like England is the most expensive in the OECD, doesn't it? But this isn't actually accurate, because in America it's only looking at public institutions, public universities. And so most of or many of the big universities that you'll have heard of, Columbia and Harvard and Yale and so on, they're private universities. So actually, if you look at the OECD data, and they don't do a combined chart on this, the average undergraduate fees for a university undergrad in America at a private university is $31,875, which would be all the way up there with that other orange arrow. So the UK is very, very expensive. It's not quite as expensive as America, but it is very, very expensive. It's worth just dwelling on America for just a second, because very high fees are a barrier to access and operate in a discriminatory fashion. It directly discriminates on the basis of income and wealth of parents, and of course that has indirect discriminatory effects to the extent that income and wealth overlap with other, what we call inequality law protected characteristics, like race and disability and so on. So in the States, you have an almost perfect match between going to college or going to university and parental income. So what this shows down on the x-axis is the rank of people by their parents' income, the 10th percentile or the top 1% up here, that's the richest. And on the y-axis, you've got the percent attending college. And so basically, if your parents are richer, you're more likely to go to university. And if your parents are poorer, you're less likely to go to university. And so the land of opportunity is not America, it's probably somewhere more like Denmark. So that is the direction in which we are heading. I'd love to be able to show you a similar chart for the UK, but we don't have the data yet. But what we can show you is the tuition fee levels in the UK. So this is a story that many of us will be familiar with. Tuition fees were introduced in 1998, originally at £1,000 for students. Then under Tony Blair's government, beginning in the academic year of 2006, tuition fees were tripled up to £3,000 a year for undergraduate home students. And then in 2011, kicking in 2012, the Cameron-Clegg government tripled or virtually tripled tuition fees again. And the difference between these lines is that the blue line shows the nominal level of fees, and the red line shows the real level of fees adjusted for inflation. And so although fees were raised to £9,000 in 2012, it pretty much stayed the same, except they went up slightly to 9,250 in, when was it, 2017. And so the red line is showing how £9,000 fees would be about 14,000 quid in today's money, but that has gone down. So universities have become less expensive than they were then, but they're still very, very, very expensive. So you might be wondering, where does all this money go? So universities are sitting on piles of cash. What are they doing with it? So the answer is they mainly seem to be building buildings or bureaucracy. So in 2018, we had a report that I've highlighted here that teaching for undergraduates accounts for just 40 to 45% of the current fee. And the remainder is spent on valuable facilities, such as libraries, but I mean, actually it's fewer libraries than just buildings. If you go look at the LSE, you know, it's like a big construction company. They're building buildings all around Lincoln's Inn Fields, very nice and shiny. That's where most of the universities have been putting lots and lots of money. How universities went on a building spree as tuition fees poured in was the headline in 2016. Has more money been going into teaching? I mean, we call these tuition fees. Well, the answer is no, precisely the opposite, because if you look at academic salaries, this is for a starting lecturer, you can see that when adjusted for inflation, a university lecturer's starting salary has declined by around, well over 20%. So it depends on whether you look at the retail price inflation index measure of inflation or the consumer price index measure of inflation, red one for RPI, blue one for CPI. You can see that, for instance, if we look at RPI, whereas, what's this, 2023, a starting lecturer would earn something like £47,000. If they got a job back in 2008, they would have been earning about £66,000. So that's a cut of about £19,000 by RPI. If you go on the measure which doesn't take into account all living costs like housing, then just look at CPI, then it's still a cut of £11,000 since 2009. So all that money for tuition fees is simply not going into tuition. On the contrary, people who do the teaching are being paid less and less and less. Now, the other thing that's happening, and I'm sure a number of you in here might be international students. Another thing that's happening, as you know, is that international student fees have been going up and up and up and up and up and up. And that creates a very big problem for universities because if they are being if they're not having money from the government anymore, if tuition fees are going down in real terms because the cap is staying, then universities are doing everything that they can to make sure that their income from international students increases. And so we have the very unpalatable headlines like these, that universities all around the country have been accepting international students with significantly lower grades than they would otherwise be than home students. So the standards are being lowered. The University of York admitted this explicitly in January this year. University of York, says the Financial Times, lowers the bar for overseas students after financial challenges, quote unquote. Wyon in the middle there is saying UK universities enrolling foreign students with poor English to get high fees. University franchise courses are signing up students with very weak English or low attainment, the regulator says in September. And of course, all of this is driven by just the necessity to keep everything running. Okay, so how is the UK university sector performing as a whole? Well, you think that one of the best indicators would be the amount of innovation, and a good proxy for that would be patent filings. So we introduced university fees in 1998. It's obviously been bad for academics, or it hasn't translated into academic pay going up. Has it done anything good for innovation? Well, the answer is it just doesn't look like it. If we look at the number of patents filed in the UK per million people, it's halved between 2000 and 2021. That comes from Our World in Data. So there could be lots of reasons for that, but one of the most significant reasons you might think would be public funding for research that does the sort of stuff that would go into inventing things in patents, which you can patent. University finances are also very weak, so there's a big crisis for many universities as of this year, because universities that run with the teachers' pension scheme, and that's mostly post-92 universities, they have seen their pension, mandatory pension contributions rise by 5% for employers, because Jeremy Hunt, the last Chancellor of the Exchequer, said, in ways to just find money for the government, that he was just going to put up pension contributions for those universities. That affects around 8,000 members in English higher education. So that simply means that universities that have the teachers' pension scheme has 5% less money than they used to. And so that kicked in April 2024, and sure enough, the next month, in May 2024, the Office for Students was reporting that 40% of universities were in deficit, and there are all sorts of problems right now evolving with compulsory redundancies up and down the country. There was similar, different, but problem in a similar way for other universities with the other type of pension, the University Superannuation Scheme. Between 2018 and 2022, the people who manage the USS pension fund wanted to drive through lots of cuts, turn it from a defined benefit scheme where you get a guaranteed income in retirement to a lump sum pension system where the money might run out. And this caused 4 or 5 years worth of strikes, the attempt to drive through cuts, and also rises in contributions were constantly coming from USS, which caused problems for university finances. And all this means that because we don't have a system that's coherent and publicly funded, universities are in a very, very difficult financial position. And yet they still seem to be spending lots of money on buildings and bureaucracy growing. I heard anecdotally a couple of weeks ago, I'm still trying to chase down the statistics, but if you look at the balance of academic staff to professional services staff in the UK, it's about 1 academic for 1.2 professional services staff. So there's slightly more people working in universities that do the administrative work. If you go to a country like Germany, it's 1 academic to 0.8 professional services staff. So there's a pretty significant difference in the amount of extra management that UK universities have been developing. And all of this is happening while the governance structures are, as I said, mostly with governing bodies that are self-appointing, and because no money is coming from the public sector, or very little money is coming from the public sector anymore, you don't have a government exercising oversight over how universities spend their money. Okay, so if we look at models and options to meet the goals set up by human rights law, there's a fairly straightforward list of things that we can do that we see elsewhere. So one thing, and also to meet the pledge that Keir Starmer originally set when he was running for Labour leader, is that you could just replace tuition fees with tax. There's a lot of different kinds of taxes that you could go for, but the one that's just been raised recently is employers' national insurance contributions. It was just raised by 1.2%, and if you look at the cost of university tuition fees, it would amount to 0.57% rise in national insurance contributions, or just taking that money from the existing budget and finding money elsewhere. I'll get to that in just a second in a bit more detail. Second thing that you could do is, if you think that Oxford and Scotland and Cambridge and universities in London seem to be working relatively well to other counterparts in England, then we might look at doing what they do in their governance structures, so having more staff elected to governing bodies and more alumni and students as well. It would be very easy to change nursery regulations so that it would cost money, but it would be easy to change it so that you have free public nurseries after 6 months, and you can make sure that matches the amount of time that people have to take off work for childcare by raising and equalising paid parental leave up to 6 months as well, or 26 weeks. And we talked about that in one of the first lectures in labour rights reform. Okay, but all of this is going to cost, or some of this at least, the tuition fee part will cost money. What are the benefits and the costs of reform? First of all, there's the figure. We could save £471 million in each research excellence framework funding cycle simply by abolishing the REF and giving money out on a per staff student basis. The research suggests that the difference is so small in allocations to each university from the REF that it's not statistically significant. So all this evaluation of academics actually makes very, very little difference compared to if you just gave out the money without the 471 million quid exercise on a per staff and student funding formula. You could save another 32 million quid if you got rid of the Office for Students, which we didn't have before 2017. But the big thing is how much would tuition fees cost? And a report by London Economics crunched the numbers and came to this figure of 11 billion odd pounds per year to ensure that home student fees have tuition free, which amounts to 0.57% of national insurance contributions on employers. This is taken from its report. It actually came up with some slightly different numbers as well, which I've just highlighted here. So if you only wanted to tax employers of people who had actually got a degree, it would be a little bit more, 1.13% rise in national insurance contributions. But that would only be taxing the employers of graduates, so effectively a graduate tax. Or you could have a 3% rise in corporation tax. Okay, so that concludes the first half, and these are questions for discussion. First of all, to what extent should university fees be abolished? And actually, there's a big discussion also about what we do over international fees. We've got the numbers for home student fees. Is there a way to ensure that international students can also have a way of getting to university equally without barriers through fees? And what are the most optimal means of funding universities? Second, what are the most effective ways to secure university finances? Thirdly, how should university governing bodies be appointed? and how should nurseries be reformed. So I'd like to welcome Jim Dickinson up on stage now, and we'll kick off a discussion. So round of applause for Jim. So, Jim, just to introduce you very quickly. So Jim, you work at a leading higher education publication, WonkHE. You were also an official at the National Union of Students before this, some time ago, doing campaigns and policy work. So you've been heavily involved with the whole sector. I'm sure have lots to say. Perhaps I could just start by asking you about the sort of big question of tuition fees, because we've had this rise by about 300 quid to 9,500 odd pounds, and there doesn't really seem to be any kind of plan that the government's stating. It's sort of holding its cards about what it wants to do. So, I mean, what do you think the different options are, and what might be the best ones to take?
Look, the part of the reason that I think the question of tuition fees for home students, at least undergraduate tuition fees for home students, is so interesting, is partly because it's really, really difficult to understand what's going on behind the headlines of the numbers, right? So your numbers were quite vivid, I thought. But to give you an example, when I worked at the National Union of Students, the proposal was to take £3,000 tuition fees to £9,000. That was a gift in our lap because we could develop banners and placards that said they're tripling tuition fees. The problem is that what we knew is that they weren't in the long term tripling the amount of money that students would pay, right? So we took advantage of that. And what's going on there is the government at the time assumed that in real terms, having loaned the money out to students, that half of it would come back in the form of loan repayments. So notwithstanding the fact that a kind of human private finance initiative was being accelerated, what was really happening was we were going from £3,000 fees to £4,500 fees in terms of the amount that we would expect individuals rather than the state to put in, albeit from this kind of convoluted income contingent loan scheme. Now, obviously, the headline there, £9,000, that's fantastic. But what that also says to us is the question about tuition fees is partly about the balance of contributions between the state and the individual. Now, what student loans do is two things. They shift the cost onto the individual rather than the state, and they delay when that money comes in. So you have to loan people the money to have it come back in for all those access principles that you've talked about and that people rehearse regularly. If you just look at the kind of balance of contributions, it seems to me that from a principle point of view, it has to be the case that there are some forms of education that are principally have private benefits, not public benefits, okay? There have to be, in theory, some types of education. And you can go quite broad or quite narrow, depending on how principled you are about it, where the benefits are pretty bloody individual. And the question at that point is, unless you are a particular type of country, which we're not, what is the appropriate balance between the individual and the state in any form of education? Now, one of the things that's really interesting about £9,000 fees is that just before the pandemic, the government had slowly, by twiddling the terms and conditions of student loans in a way that most people haven't spotted, got to a point where about 40 pence in the pound was going to be put in by the state as a result of students not having to pay back their loan after 30 years. It gets written off. Then Rishi Sunak, while he was as Chancellor, made further changes. It means that undergraduates, home undergraduates that start now, have to pay back earlier. In fact, from April the 1st, because of the way that the minimum wage works, they'll have to start paying back almost immediately. and they'll have to pay back for 40 years. And that means the state now is only intending to put in 20p in the pound. Now, put it like this. If we're in a position where, either for practical reasons or ideological reasons, it will remain the case that people take a view that the benefits of higher education are partly public and partly individual, the question for me is, what is the appropriate balance between how much the individual should put in for their private goods and how much the state should put in for their goods? And if we've now reached a point where 20 pence in the pound in those undergraduate tuition fees is being picked up by the state, what we should have is an honest and explicit conversation as a country about the idea that we are framing contributions to higher education individually in terms of tuition fees, but then still expecting universities to produce this raft of public goods in terms of all of the sorts of stuff that you have talked about. Because, you know, of course it is the case that students, probably, you know, students that come to King's are going to do really well in their career and will get really, you know, significant private benefits. But of course it's also the case that lots of the things that King's does and produces and the way it runs have huge benefits for society. So if there's a mix between private and public, we need to have an honest and explicit conversation about what the appropriate balance should be, it seems to me, between private and public. And once you've worked that out, then you can work out how you pick it up from individuals. Do you pick it up front, or do you pick it up in this kind of human PFI way that we've done via student loans?
That's really interesting. I suppose, I mean, if you had the state paying for more university degrees, or you had tuition-free university, then the state would logically want to ensure that the types of degrees that are being done are ones that have benefit, not, you know, Mickey Mouse degrees. And I suppose we've got a kind of very laissez-faire approach that we just, you know, universities offer degrees according to what the demand is, and universities essentially set internally what degrees are offered. I mean, do you think that's something that we see more in other countries around Europe, that they have more of a control on the kinds of degrees that are being offered?
Well, I mean, look, one of the things, of course, that accompanies lots of the systems that were on the right-hand side of your sort of chart is places are rationed, right? I mean, you know, if you're publicly funding them, you ration the places. One of the problems the government has had, successive governments have had, since a cap on the number of people that could go to university from the UK was lifted, is it can't control the numbers of people that want to go. And then when universities are trying to manage their finances, they're bound to run the stuff and promote the stuff that's cheapest to deliver. And the result is that doesn't necessarily produce the public benefits. And government goes round and round in circles trying to work out how to fix the market rather than just have a slightly different system. The thing that I would say, though, is it is true that the UK system is particularly expensive per student per year, right? Some of your charts illustrated that. There's other charts available from the OECD. And one of the things that we've been doing actually at WonkHE over the past few months is trying to work out why. Now, some of it's about research costs, and some of it is about history, in particular, London is a particular thing, and so on. But one of the things that people don't spot is, out of the OECD, the UK has the youngest undergraduates in the OECD. So we force our kids to go to university earlier. That means that when they arrive, because they're suddenly plunged into independent study, the more you diversify the sorts of students that go, they need more support. And then our student finance system prevents people from slowing down. So we also have the fastest graduating bachelor's students in the OECD. Ours is very slightly above 3 years. Most countries it's much longer. And the result of that, of course, is that we've got a more diverse group of students than 20 years ago, who need more support, and who, if you have a setback, you have a mental health episode, or you need to earn a bit of extra money in the Netherlands or in France or wherever, you can reduce your number of credits each semester. Here in the UK, you can't. So what do? It's not all shiny buildings. A lot of those professional services staff are basically helping students to not drop out because we have a set of rules that pretty much requires them to get out as fast as possible and enter the labour market as fast as possible. And of course, when they then enter the labour market, there aren't that many opportunities for people in their early 20s. So we have a bunch of things going on in the background which are about traditions and going to university as soon as you leave school and getting through university as fast as possible and not allowing people to slow down. Anyone that's international in the room that's doing an international postgraduate talk qualification will also know how bloody proud we are that we can get in postgraduate talk students a master's in 1 year. That's one of the big selling points of the UK. Add that to the speed with which we do undergraduate stuff, and again, it prevents people from slowing down. Why is it that a master's student via the Home Office couldn't do that in 18 months by reducing their number of credits, but still paying the same tuition fee? All of the underpinning wiring is based on ramming people through at top speed, and that produces all of those costs that then make the system look expensive to govern. And that would require real cultural change, I think, in terms of the way the UK sells itself to international students and the way that the country thinks of, often, university as big school.
And it would be interesting to see how the statistics have changed over time, because some of the data is quite opaque.
Yeah.
You get a figure for anyone who wants to look up higher education data. You get a figure for staff costs, because that doesn't always break down the difference between staff who are earning very little and staff who are earning quite a lot at the top. One idea I'd like to put to you, and maybe this can sort of connect into governance, is the sort of resource curse kind of problem that's created, or that was created when universities got all this tuition fee money. So before you got all this money from government, and government could attach conditions, and then suddenly universities had £3,000 and £9,000 for every student, but they're sitting on this money and they can do pretty much what they like with it. And you know, the resource curse in a country that sort of strikes it rich with oil, it creates a problem that the people in charge now, with all this wealth, can translate that into power and use it to oppress their own populations. And they become sort of more and more authoritarian. This is the resource curse. You think it's going to be a blessing to have natural resources, but actually it isn't. And I wonder whether there's an analogy with universities, because there just aren't very many controls in the way that all this money is used. You don't have governance standards that require stakeholder voice that would ensure that students can say that the money should be used for us, or staff can say that the money should be used fairly for research and teaching. So, I mean, do you think there's an analogy there, or and if so, what might be the remedy?
Look, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the shift to £9,000 fees, where the bulk of the income comes in by chasing individual students to come to your university rather than getting a grant, plus the lifting of numbers caps. We then spent 5 years without regulating that properly, because there wasn't government bandwidth in Parliament to pass different types of regulation. When they eventually established regulation through the Office for Students, their choice was to regulate principally not on what happens here or what people do here, but what the outcomes are. So the number one way in which universities are regulated for undergraduates is how many people get to the second year, which has its own incentives and disincentives in terms of what's called dropout, how many people complete the course, and how many people get what's called a graduate job in the data. What that means, of course, is that if you're an undergraduate at King's, it's pretty likely, given your socio-economics, if you're from the UK, that you'll have the money, the financial support, the backing from parents and others to get to the second year and get to the end of the course. And it's pretty likely that you're going to get a bang-up graduate job, looking at the statistics. What, of course, that means, therefore, is there's no regulation at all on what happens here. Yeah? So if I'm a student sat in a part of this university, not in one of your lectures, but in perhaps a lecture being delivered by someone who really doesn't want to deliver it, or by a member of academic staff who can't be bothered that day, so gets a PhD student to do it for them with no prep, there's nothing I can do about it. There's notionally some sense that there's consumer protection law backing me up. Nothing I can do about it, because all of the regulatory focus is on outcomes, not what actually happens here. And I think that's one particular problem. What do you do about it then, I think, becomes interesting. So one of the options, of course, is to go down the road of saying, the moment you've paid tuition fees, there's a bunch of minimum things that you should get. And I am a fan of that. I'm actually a fan of consumer protection law in higher education, not because I think students are consumers, but because I think when the university says we will offer X, it should be under a really clear enforceable legal duty to then deliver X. But X is normally the minimum. And the question you speak to, I think, is how do you put students in a position, and to some extent staff, where they can influence the maximum, the ideal world? Where does the money go in an ideal world? And the thing that I would say about that is the UK is absolutely useless at organisations that aren't either private companies or the state. So we basically have two models. The state runs it, and that became very unpopular and was seen as very inefficient. Or a private company runs it with private company style governance, because private companies can drive out all of the unnecessary costs. What's almost unique about the UK in Europe is that almost every other European country has both a better tradition and a set of regulations around what I would call quasi-public organisations. So, for example, if I was in the Netherlands today, there's an entire legislative framework around quasi-public organisations. And they're called quasi-public organisations not necessarily because there's private money in there, but because they're not run directly by the state. The assumption is that the people they serve, their beneficiaries, their community, their staff, in the case of universities, their students, in the case of hospitals, their patients, and so on, should have a clear stake in the governance. So, for example, in the Netherlands, almost half of the governing body is staff, almost half of the governing body is students. The rector, the equivalent of a vice-chancellor or principal, has to be elected. And those universities have not fallen over. They're not crumbling. They're not slipping down the international league tables. And in fact, in the face of quite significant budget cuts over the past couple of months from an emergent right in the Netherlands in Parliament, last week, 20,000 staff, students and rectors were on the streets. And proportionally to the population, that is a hell of a lot of people, right? 20,000 staff, students and rectors were on the streets showing solidarity about the need to fund public higher education. And that isn't because those bodies are run directly by the state, like some kind of Eastern European country. It's because that is a country that has put a set of scaffolding around quasi-public organisations. Because it seems to me that if we don't want, in exchange for more money from the state, to be directly run by the state, there are millions of reasons why that's a bad idea for universities, some of which are cultural and ideological and so on. But at the same time, it also seems to me that we do want there to be more of a contribution from the state for the amazing public goods that universities generate. And what that requires, and this is hard for the civil servants that work in the UK, to imagine a different kind of organisation delivering publicly. That, as I say, isn't the state or the local council or a private company, it's something in between, something in the middle, that is characteristic of a body that is democratic and serves its staff and students and so on and so on.
And that's really interesting, because what we covered in previous weeks is the NHS and water and transport and energy. And actually you can see stakeholder models of governance in all of these, in little places, in little bits and pieces in the UK. But when we look at other countries abroad, then you see a lot more of it. And the Netherlands example is really interesting. But so basically what you're talking about is stakeholder representation when you've got an organisation that affects the public interest. It might not be state-owned, but like the university affects the public.
I mean, the other thing that I would say, so I work quite a lot with student unions, okay? Student unions in this country were required to become charities in terms of registering with the Charities Commission about 15 years ago. Our charity law covers mutuals in this country, so it covers mutual associations. But all the models and all the tradition is a charity tradition. And what are charities? They're the great and the good, giving's the not so great and not so good. Now, you can have a governance structure around that, and that's fine, but we have almost no governance traditions or structures around people doing things for each other or themselves. And what does that mean? What are most universities? Well, they're actually charities legally, and they behave like that. They're corporate, and there's a sense that this great and good set of people will govern them on behalf of staff and students who need to be told and won't know any better if they got together and worked it out for themselves. And that's one of the big pressures, you know, a type of regulation, a type of framework that said we believe in communities being able to run things all on their own, rather than characterising that as either inefficient or wasteful or whatever, that would help.
Yes, and it's interesting that Cambridge and Oxford seem to have the most representative governing bodies and stakeholders. Yeah. Okay, I'd like to bring in everyone here. Would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? We'll start with you, and
maybe we can get you on the microphone. Daniel, would you mind running over?
very much. And if you could just say your name and if you're on outside the Kings, with them on my phone.
Hello, so I'm Sandrine, I live in the UK. So I have just a few points. So taking the example of Scotland, where you have free tuition, they still have shortages in GP staff. So it wouldn't solve one issue in that respect. So